If you are in the market for a new camera right now, you are probably facing a frustrating question. Do you buy something today, or do you wait for the Sony A6900? This is one of the most common dilemmas in tech purchasing, and cameras are no exception. Waiting for the next big release can save you from buyer's remorse, but it can also mean missing out on months of shooting, learning your gear, and actually creating content while you sit around refreshing leak forums. So let's actually work through this properly based on what we currently know and figure out who should wait, who should buy now, and who this camera might not even be relevant to. First, it helps to establish exactly what kind of camera the A6900 is shaping up to be because that determines who it is actually for. Based on the leaks, this is not a beginner camera, and it is not primarily a resolution-focused stills camera either. Everything about the rumored spec sheet, the stacked sensor, the high burst rates, the emphasis on reduced rolling shutter, points toward a camera built for speed and motion. That means the people who should be paying closest attention are sports photographers, wildlife shooters, run-and-gun videographers, and hybrid creators who need their camera to keep up with fast, unpredictable subjects. If your photography mostly involves landscapes, portraits in controlled settings, product photography, or other relatively static subjects, the specific advantages of this camera are going to matter far less to you, and you likely should not let this release delay a purchase you already need to make. For sports and wildlife shooters specifically, this is probably the clearest case for waiting, assuming your current gear is genuinely holding you back. If you are shooting fast-moving subjects with an older camera that struggles with rolling shutter, buffer depth, or autofocus tracking, the reported specs of the A6900, a stacked sensor, 30 frames per second burst shooting, and Sony's proven subject tracking system, would represent a substantial practical upgrade rather than just a marginal spec bump. The frustration of missing a shot because your buffer filled up or your camera couldn't keep a fast-moving subject in focus is a real, tangible problem that this camera is specifically being designed to solve. If that describes your current situation, it is reasonable to hold off on a purchase for a few more months if you can manage without new gear in the meantime. For video-first creators, the calculation is a little more nuanced. The current A6700 already offers strong 4K video performance with solid autofocus, and for a huge percentage of YouTube, social media, and documentary-style content, it remains more than capable. The A6900's advantages for video creators would mainly show up in reduced rolling shutter during fast pans or handheld movement, and potentially expanded high frame rate options thanks to the added processing power. If you frequently shoot fast-moving handheld footage, action sequences, or content where visible skew and jello distortion has been a recurring annoyance, waiting could genuinely solve that problem. But if your content is mostly talking head videos, sit-down interviews, or relatively controlled B-roll, the A6700 or even older Sony bodies will likely continue to serve you just fine, and the A6900's headline improvements will be largely invisible in your actual output. There is also a financial reality worth being honest about. New flagship cameras almost always launch at a premium price, and that price tends to come down over the following 12 to 18 months as the camera matures in the market and eventually gets replaced by something newer. If budget is a significant factor in your decision, and it usually is, there is a real argument for either buying a current generation camera like the A6700 now at a lower price point, or waiting not just for the A6900's launch, but for the inevitable price adjustments and open box or refurbished deals that follow a few months after release. Being an early adopter of a brand new flagship camera is rarely the most cost-effective path, even if it is the most exciting one. It is also worth thinking about this from the angle of what happens to the current lineup once the A6900 launches. Historically, when Sony releases a new flagship APS-C body, the previous generation, in this case the A6700, tends to see meaningful price drops, both from Sony directly and through retailer promotions as they clear inventory. If your budget is tight and you do not specifically need the A6900 speed and stacked sensor advantages, waiting for the A6900 to launch and then buying a discounted A6700 shortly after could actually be the smartest financial move available to you. You would get a camera that already covers the vast majority of what most creators need at a meaningfully reduced price, without paying the early adopter premium on brand new technology. Another factor worth considering is how mature the A6900 will actually be at launch. New camera bodies, especially ones built around genuinely new sensor and processor technology, rather than incremental updates. Sometimes ship with firmware quirks or autofocus behavior that gets refined over the following months through updates. Sony has historically been fairly responsive with firmware improvements after launch, but early adopters do sometimes deal with minor rough edges that later buyers avoid entirely. If you have professional work booked that depends entirely on your gear performing flawlessly, it is worth thinking carefully about whether you want to be shooting client work on a camera that is only weeks old, or whether it makes more sense to let the camera mature for a few months while you continue working with proven, reliable gear. There is also the ecosystem question, which matters more than people sometimes give it credit for. If you're already invested in Sony E-mount lenses, this decision is relatively straightforward, since the A6900 will slot directly into your existing kit without requiring any additional investment beyond the body itself. But if you're currently shooting on a different system entirely, whether that's Fujifilm, Canon, or something else, and you are considering switching specifically because of the A6900, it is worth pausing and thinking about the full cost of that decision. Switching systems means not just buying a new body, but potentially replacing lenses, accessories, and rebuilding familiarity with an entirely new menu system and control layout.